I'm delighted to welcome back to Books for a Better World, Grant Quertermous, who has a new job. So congratulations, Grant. As Stephanie mentioned, he's now the Curator and Director of Collections for the Classical American Homes Preservation Trust, and of course was formerly the Curator of Tudor Place Historic Home and Garden. He's the author of A Georgetown Life, The Reminiscences of Britannia Kennon, Kennon, which is publishing today. Yeah, thank you, Grant, from Georgetown University Press. We're very proud to be your publisher. And that's going to be, the book will be, of course, the topic of our discussion today. So thank you again, Grant, for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be back, Al. Thank you very much.
Great. So to start, I'm wondering if you can give us a brief overview of Britannia Kennon's life and describe what the reminiscences, which form the basis of this book, what they are.
Sure. So Britannia Wellington Peter Kennon was the youngest child of Thomas and Martha Peter. She was born at Tudor Place in 1815 and lived at the estate for all but a few years of her life, which included the first decade of the 20th century. She actually died at Tudor Place in 1911 on the eve of her 96th birthday. So through her mother, Martha Custis Peter, Britannia was a great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, and because of her longevity and her familial connections, she became sort of a celebrity in the late 19th century because of this historical connection and this amazing collection that she had of at Tudor Place, these objects associated with George and Martha Washington that she lived amongst. And of course, during the late 19th century in the US, there was this surge of patriotism and fascination with all things from colonial America, starting around the time of the 1876 centennial. So you've got Britannia, who by then is an older woman. She could recall visiting Lafayette, and stories of George and Martha Washington that were shared with her mother, or shared by her mother, when she was a young girl. So the reminiscences are actually an oral history. It's a series of interviews with Britannia that were conducted by her grandchildren starting in the late 1890s. They wrote down stories, family histories, and other information that she recalled as they sat around the parlor at Tudor Place. Memories of Tudor Place during the Civil War, even stories, as I mentioned, about earlier generations of the family, information about neighbors in Georgetown, and even clues for room use at Tudor Place. So I've actually referred to the reminiscences as sort of the Rosetta Stone for Tudor Place, because it provided so many answers for the interpretation of the house and the property. She details even which family members were born in what rooms of the house, and even rooms in which some family members died.
Thank you. And so can you tell us what inspired you to write this book?
Sure. The book actually came about in a conversation almost 2 years ago with a colleague at Tudor Place, who is the Director of Education and Visitor Services. She and I were talking about, because, the reminiscences is such a great source of information that they're mentioned during tours by the Tudor Place docents. And, it's rare to have this level of documentation about life in an early 19th century house. So visitors would frequently ask the staff and the docents if the reminiscences were available, if they could purchase a copy in the museum shop after their tour, or if there were books where they could read more about Britannia. Then on another level, I was thinking about the scholarly value of the reminiscences and making this important resource more widely available to a scholarly community. Previously, anyone who wanted to access the contents of the reminiscences had to make an appointment in the Tudor Place archives to utilize a bound typescript. And I think the publication of the book makes it a much more widely accessible resource. And for both of these audiences, I wanted to include some contextual and supporting materials. I didn't want to present the reminiscences without an introduction to Britannia, the biographical essay, or an explanation on how this document came about and the value both in the 19th century and now of these first-person recollections, sort of, how this was important to the grandchildren, how we can use it now. And similarly, I also felt like I needed to provide the reader with a family tree. It's a pretty complex family genealogy. There's a plethora of identically named family members, and as well as, cousins and aunts and uncles. And Britannia uses nicknames for some people. And so I wanted to include information about all these people. If I remember correctly, I think the appendix, which includes the mini biographies of these individuals, has something like 300 names in it, give or take. And, last but not least, I really wanted the reader to understand that Britannia was a product of the era in which she lived, the antebellum South, that her parents owned a large number of enslaved individuals, and that she, up until the advent of the Civil War, was a slave owner herself. And to not look at Britannia without understanding this context, to make sense of some of the comments she makes about various things.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we'll want to come back to the plantations and
Yes.
the enslaved individuals at Tudor Place, later in the conversation. I saw in a recent interview that you did with Matthew Gilmore on the HDC list that you described Britannia as a strong and independent woman, and you mentioned that was a kind of trait that ran through the family. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about her early life, her childhood, what she says about that in her oral history, and how that came to help form her character.
Sure. I mean, she's actually, unlike her older sisters who were educated in Philadelphia, or an older brother who attends Yale, she was actually schooled locally in Georgetown. First as a young girl at a school run by two sisters, the Mrs. Wrights, that was located on N Street. And then later as a teenager, she attended the Young Ladies Academy at Visitation Convent, the school that's established by the Sisters of the Order of the Visitation of Holy Mary, that's known today as Georgetown Visitation. So, while she's there, she not only receives an education in academic subjects, but also part of the curriculum included various domestic skills that were thought to prepare the young ladies to manage a household and to be, accomplished wives and mothers. And in fact, we actually have in the Tudor Place collection some examples of her academic artwork, needlework, and theorem paintings that she made. So like I said, she's the youngest child of Thomas and Martha Peter, and there's about a 10-year difference between her and her sister that she's closest to in age, America. So she's, the baby of the family. That's the other thing I should mention, that Thomas and Martha Peter are ardent Federalists. They name their three daughters Columbia, America, and Britannia. So Britannia is born only a few months after the British burn Washington. Martha Peter was actually pregnant with Britannia when she's standing at the window at Tudor Place to watch the fires from the city in August of 1824. So as I said in that interview with Matt, I think Britannia really follows this tradition of very, strong, independent women in the family. Her mother, Martha Custis Peter, was for 20 years after the death of her husband, Thomas Peter, is running Tudor Place and, all these family properties. Britannia in the same way, and I'll talk a little more about her widowhood later on, but had a period of living at Tudor Place as a widow for 67 years. She never remarries in this, and that's a whole nother interesting aspect of her life. And there's a lot of similarities, as I've pointed out in one of the essays in the book, between her and her great-grandmother, Martha Washington. Britannia, after the death of her daughter, actually steps in and raises her grandchildren as if they were her own children, very much in the same way that Martha Washington basically raises two of her grandchildren almost as their own adopted children, Nellie Custis Lewis and George Washington Parke Custis.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about what Britannia has to say about her relationship with her husband, Beverly Kennon?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting relationship. He's about almost 20 years older than she is. He was a widower and a naval officer. At the time they met, and then at the time of their marriage, he was commandant of the Washington Naval Yard. He was a career naval officer and a veteran of the War of 1812. His father, Richard Kennon, had actually served on General Washington's staff during the American Revolution and was actually the first governor of the Louisiana Territory appointed by Thomas Jefferson. So through his mother, he's actually a member of the Beverly family of Virginia, and it was actually one of his Beverly cousins who was a neighbor in Georgetown. The Beverlys actually lived at the estate that's now Dumbarton Oaks. It was across the street from Tudor Place. She's actually the one who introduces Britannia and Beverly Kennon, actually. And so this happened in 1841. They actually get married the following year on December 8th of 1842 in the Tudor Place drawing room. And following their marriage, they actually moved to the Naval Yard where he's living for a time. And then they move over to H Street. He was promoted within the Navy Department. He was the chief of construction and repair, and the Naval Department building was actually adjacent to the White House. So they moved to H Street to be closer to his office there. And their marriage only lasted 16 months. He was actually tragically killed in February of 1844 during a shipboard explosion. They are actually demonstrating a new gun that was ironically called the Peacemaker on a naval vessel, the Princeton. They were doing a sail on the Potomac. They demonstrate the gun a couple of times with no problems. They fire it again as they're passing Fort Washington, coming back upriver, and the gun explodes. Commodore Kennon is killed instantly, as well as the Secretary of State and the Secretary of the Navy at the time. It's pretty amazing because President Tyler was on board the boat. Britannia herself was on the boat, as well as a number of other private individuals as well, Dolly Madison. And so Britannia actually didn't initially know that her husband had been killed, but found out later. So she, as I said, goes into this period of widowhood for the next 67 years. And, you know, she talks very fondly about their marriage, but that's the one thing she never really goes into detail with her grandchildren about, is the day of his death and her experiences around that time. As I mentioned in the book, I think she always even associated the White House, the president's house, as it was called that time, with the funeral that took place for he and the other victims of the explosion that happened several days later. Because in 1904, 60 years after the explosion, she's actually invited to a event during Teddy Roosevelt's administration, and she doesn't go. The response card and everything still survive in the Tudor Place archives. And I think it's because she always associated the East Room with the White House with her husband's funeral and this very dark time in her life around the time of his death. At the time she was widowed, she had about a 4-month-old daughter. And so she and her daughter come back to Tudor Place, that was then her mother, Martha Custis Peters' house, and as I said, lived for the next 67 years. So she's really a fascinating person.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, the detail about the funeral is fascinating. I'm wondering, you mentioned her daughter, and I was going to ask you about that next, that if you could talk a little bit about her relationship with her daughter, Marquis, but also her stepsons from, I guess, Commodore Kennon's previous marriage.
Can you repeat the first? You actually cut out. Sorry about that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about her relationship with her children.
Yes. So as I mentioned.
Yeah, and her stepsons. Yeah.
Okay. So at the time Britannia and Commodore Kennon were married, he had 2 stepsons from his previous marriage. Interestingly enough, his first wife was actually a distant relationship of Martha Washington as well. So that's an interesting commonality between Elizabeth Claiborne Kennon and Britannia. But yeah, so she had 2 stepsons. She remained very close to them. They were in school in Richmond. Her account book suggests that she was going down there frequently to visit them. She was buying school supplies, paying for their schooling and stuff. And they both, even later in life, continued to come back and visit her at Tudor Place. But Marquis, her daughter, was named Martha Custis Kennon. There's a tradition in the Peter family of naming the eldest daughter Martha as an honorific to Martha Washington. Martha, several generations going down the family did that, but she was known as Marquis. Her daughter Marquis actually married in 1867 a distant cousin, Dr. Armistead Peter, and that's how the Peter name comes back into the line for Tudor Place, because of course Tudor Place was continually owned by the Peter family from 1805 until 1983, following the death of Britannia's great-grandson, Armistead Peter III. But yeah, she and Marquis were very close. She actually sends Marquis to Philadelphia. So unlike herself, who was educated in Georgetown, Marquis is educated in Philadelphia. And it's right, actually, they're traveling at the time of the outbreak of the Civil War. So they almost become refugees as they're traveling around Virginia for a couple of months in 1861. But Britannia actually outlives her daughter. Marquis tragically dies in 1886. I believe she's 41 or 42, if I'm doing the math correctly. So again, Britannia, who lives, as I said, to the eve of her 96th birthday, survives, outlives her parents, all of her siblings, both her daughter and son-in-law, and a number of other family members as well. So it's
remarkable.
amazing.
Yeah. So I don't know if you like this comparison, but I sometimes think of Britannia as the Zelig of the 19th century, because she seems to have been met everyone famous and been in the right place at the right time. And I was wondering if you could talk us through some of the famous politicians and other figures of the age whom she met.
Oh, sure. And this is, one of my favorite parts about the reminiscences is she tells her grandchildren about that. She, of course, recalled meeting Lafayette as a young girl when she was 9 years old. He visited Tudor Place. Her parents hosted a party for him in 1824 during his visit to Georgetown. She talks about going to parties at the president's house during Andrew Jackson's administration, where the mammoth cheese, it's either the big cheese or the mammoth cheese. This is where I confuse the cheese from Jefferson's administration with the Jackson era cheese as well. So my apologies to everyone with that, but when that large cheese is there being served. She attends several parties. She recalled at Daniel Webster's house. Of course, John C. Calhoun, vice president, senator, was actually living across the street from Tudor Place, and she talks about going to several entertainments at his house and actually taking dancing lessons with his daughter, Anna Maria Calhoun. And I think my favorite story she mentions is of Martin Van Buren. It's before he's president. It's when he's a congressman. He actually gets his carriage stuck in the mud on the 31st Street Hill as he's en route to Tudor Place on the way to a party.
Thank you. So we have a question from a participant.
Okay.
Like to read out that Britannia seems an odd choice to name a child in the wake of the War of 1812, even for a Federalist. Why did her parents choose such a seemingly unpatriotic name?
Well, I think it was patriotic, but not in the American sense. Again, it's there as part of their embrace of federalism. Martha Peter notes that she names her eldest daughter Columbia in honor of the District of Columbia. The other interesting thing about Britannia is at the time of her christening, she was given the middle name Wellington in honor of the Duke of Wellington, sort of in honor and his victory over Napoleon. So again, they named their daughter America. Her middle name was Pinckney, again in honor of Pinckney, the Federalist candidate who ran against Thomas Jefferson unsuccessfully. So again, I think it's just their ardent support of, or their love of not only the Federalist Party, but they were Anglophiles. They weren't Francophiles like so many people in the early Republic. And I think that was part of the reason why she was given that name. It's also interesting, in contrast, the two sons were given family names, George and John. So you've got, John and George, and then Columbia, America, and Britannia.
Thank you. So can you tell us a little bit about what Britannia says about enslaved and free laborers who worked at Tudor Place during her lifetime?
Sure. And, her reminiscences are a fascinating and very important source for the interpretation of Tudor Place and learning about the property in the past. And as I mentioned too, you have to take into account that the context in which Britannia, grew up, the fact that Britannia was an enslaver herself. In fact, she makes an aside about one of the enslaved individuals she's discussing and parenthetically says, "Oh, I owned her, of course," very nonchalantly, when, a modern reader might look at that sentence and, be shocked by it. But again, understanding this environment in which she grew up. You also have to remember that her parents, Thomas and Martha Peter, inherited a large number of enslaved individuals from the Custis estate, Custis dower slaves. And, for a number of these individuals, Britannia's reminiscences is one of the few sources of information we have about them. It allows us to put a name with an individual's role. So rather than just talking about the cook at Tudor Place, we can talk about her by name, Patty Allen, and know some information about her as well. We know about a number of the individuals who were enslaved, but also lived out, meaning they lived off the property. Some of them had spouses who were free. Others, of course, lived on the property. She gives us a great insight about, again, a number of individuals. And I think one of the most interesting people in the Tudor Place story is the longtime gardener at Tudor Place, John Luckett, who was actually a self-emancipated slave. He is seized as contraband by the Union Army during the Civil War, escapes from the Union Army, crosses Chain Bridge, and comes into the district. And he happens to be walking up the street in Georgetown. And sees Britannia in the garden, calls out to her to see if she needs anyone, if she's looking to hire anybody, and she says yes, and that begins an employer-employee relationship that lasts over 40 years. John Luckett works as the gardener of Tudor Place until his death in 1906. And what's amazing about that is I think they had a friendship in addition to this relationship as employer-employee. He took her grandsons hunting and fishing. He attends family graduations and other events and things like that. Interestingly enough, the family always wanted John Luckett to move and live closer to Tudor Place, but he actually lived on Capitol Hill. And I think that's very interesting, remained on Capitol Hill. He always told the Peters that he didn't want to move closer, that his family was very entrenched there in their neighborhood in Capitol Hill. And I think that's especially interesting too, that he could sort of maintain this separation between his employer and work life and his own family life there on Capitol Hill. But yeah, John Luckett's a fascinating person. In fact, when Britannia dies in 1911 and an inventory is done of the contents of the house, there's actually an image of Luckett in her bedroom. He's the only non-family member to have an image there in that part of the house. And I think that's, again, speaks to their level of friendship as well. And at the time of his death in 1906, Britannia's granddaughter Agnes actually writes an obituary for Luckett, and the obituary and a photo are included in nearly all of the Washington newspapers at the time of his death.
Thank you. Yeah, so you've alluded to a little bit to Britannia's experiences during the Civil War and the fact that she was a Southern sympathizer, and a slaver, a plantation owner, I guess, in a sense. Could you talk a little bit more detail, tell us a little bit more detail about her experiences during the war?
Gladly. As I mentioned, she and her daughter were traveling when the war broke out, and they go from Georgetown down to Staunton, Virginia, in the Shenandoah Valley. And then there are a number of battles that take place around Staunton. They're afraid that the Union Army is getting a little too close to Staunton. So then they go to Richmond, followed by Petersburg, and eventually Norfolk. And it's when they're in Norfolk that through a family friend, they get an audience with General Huger, the Confederate general who's in charge of the department of that part of Virginia and North Carolina, and are able to take a flag of truce boat and go back up to Baltimore. And from there, Britannia goes back to Tudor Place. And it's really interesting. She takes in boarders, and they're primarily Union officers and doctors associated with the hospitals in Georgetown. And that's especially interesting when you think about the fact that she's this very outspoken Southern sympathizer. She's, Mrs. Robert E. Lee is her first cousin. She's a bridesmaid in the Lee wedding. She's got nephews who are fighting for both the Union and the Confederacy. But she tells her grandchildren in the reminiscences that her rule during the household for the boarders was that the war not be discussed, that the boarders were, she said, they were aware of my sympathies and I was aware of theirs. So I think that's very interesting that, that's almost today, you think about, political opinions. That's like somebody being a very outspoken conservative hosting a large number of liberals to come live in your house and just saying, okay, we're just going to agree to disagree and not make it the topic of conversation. But yeah, I think the Civil War was a very difficult time for her. Two of her nephews were actually hanged, a nephew and a cousin were hanged as spies in 1863. That's another interesting topic. She alludes to it, but doesn't go into much detail about it in the reminiscences. And then after the Civil War, as I mentioned, is when her daughter Marky marries cousin Dr. Armistead Peter, who interestingly enough was served in the Union, or was in the hospital that was the Union hospital during the war there in Georgetown. Thank you.
Can you talk a little bit, Grant, about the kind of economic life of Tudor Place? So how did the land holdings that the family had in Maryland, how did that support life at Tudor Place?
Sure.
Finances like, that sort of thing.
So Tudor Place is what I think can accurately be called sort of an urban farmstead. It was at its height 8.5 acres. So again, a large property, especially when you consider size of property in modern day Georgetown. Now it's 5.5 acres, but it wasn't a large scale agricultural estate. They had property in Montgomery County, Maryland. Oakland's was Thomas Peter, Britannia's father's plantation there, where they're growing tobacco, another slightly later diversified agriculture. And then he had a smaller property, Effingham, which was about 100 acres up in Northeast DC. So these are properties that are, as you mentioned, supporting Tudor Place. The smokehouse was at Tudor Place, but for example, the hogs that are being raised at Oaklands are being used, they're smoked in the Tudor Place smokehouse. So that's another interesting aspect of Tudor Place, one of the earliest extant smokehouses in the District of Columbia, dated by dendrochronology to 1794, 1795.
Thank you. So I wanted to come back. I think we have time for maybe one more question to your research for the book. Were there materials outside of Tudor Place that were useful? Where did your research take you?
Yeah, they were immensely helpful. I should say that the Peter family papers are split up between 3 repositories. In addition to the collection at Tudor Place, there are family papers at Mount Vernon in the library there and at the University of Virginia in their special collections library. So each of those repositories was very useful for my project because in a lot of instances, I was able to find a receipt or a letter that provided clues to help me pinpoint the exact date of an event that Britannia describes. For example, she talks about a carriage accident that resulted in the amputation of the enslaved footman Charlie's leg. Apparently he had been drinking, he fell off the carriage and a wheel ran over his leg, which required it to be amputated. Well, in the family papers at Mount Vernon is a receipt showing that Thomas Peter paid 2 doctors, Doctors Warfield and Sim, to actually do the amputation, and they dated it's March 15th of 1824, which provides an exact date for that event and lets me know too that Britannia was 9 years old when it occurred. Similarly, materials at the National Archives from the Civil War era helped me establish exactly when Britannia and Marquis were in the Norfolk area. At Fort Monroe, the records of the Provost Marshal showed that they came through on a flag of truce boat, a neutral vessel that stopped at the fort on December 5th of 1861. So that gives me an exact date of when she's passing through because she talks about having to have her trunk searched during that and other events around that time. And I think her account books were really valuable too because I could look at a lot of the places she's traveling by her, the tickets she mentions purchasing, or some other purchases related to topics she discusses in the book. So yeah, all of these repositories were very useful to help me both with the annotations and with the essays as I was attempting to, summarize Britannia's life and biography and look at the context of these reminiscences.
Thank you. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there, but I want to thank you again for being here today.
Oh, my pleasure.
And congratulations on the book. As I say, it's published today. I wanted to give a shout out to my colleagues in our production department and our designers. It's actually, I think, a gorgeous book. It's extremely well illustrated, as you can see. And I would just urge everyone who's interested in Britannia's story to get a copy. It's really well done. Congratulations, Grant.
Oh, thank you. And I should mention one of the places that you can get it is via Tudor Place. So there's some information, I believe, on the Tudor Place website too. So I want to acknowledge my former workplace too. So
thank you. So I wanted to say to everyone that next week on October 8th, we'll be talking with Harriet Hamasi, who's the Dean of the Georgetown University Library, about libraries during the pandemic and their future. So I hope you'll be able to join us for that. And so I'll just say goodbye and stay safe, everyone. And thank you again, Grant.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.